an exhibition. And anyway, it's super nice to be there with all of you. I'm going to I'm going to show you more slides, more images than Instagram actually holds in total today. So it's going to be a bit of just the atmospheric construction, really, of some work. I'm going to start with some student work. Um, and it's the brief actually that I gave when we have a lottery each fall for the thesis seminar on studio, and I'm going to just show you the lottery images. Sorry, Sean, did you
Oh, sorry.
good to go?
No, you're good. Yep, I'll just
Okay.
play.
Okay. So I'm gonna show you basically the lottery, and sprinkled within the lottery are the sort of framework for the thesis studio, and then there are some images scattered throughout as well. I'll move through those quickly. I won't discuss the work really, but just just so you have a sense of some of the kind of work that the students do when they work with me. And then I'm going to move to some of my work, which will be less interesting. And I should say, everybody turn up for Daniel and Brian. They're both friends, and those will be awesome talks. So I'm going to see if I can share this with you. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yep, that's good.
Can you see that still?
Yep.
Awesome. So just quickly on the title, it's the title is Surface Constructions, and it really just has to do with both constructing a practice that I try to do both as a teacher and both as a maker as well, but also in the old days, let's say when I used to work properly or when I used to have time to work, I would work on drawing surfaces, and they were really, really meaningful for me at a lot of levels. And I'll touch on a couple of those levels as I move through the talk. So this is going to be really, really rapid fire. If you're interested, I have a bunch. When I get to my work, there are several lists there, which I won't exhaust at all. But if you have an interest, it seems like this is being recorded, so you could go and have a sniff at those images with the text primarily. So I'm just going to show you quickly, very, very quickly, the thesis lottery. Every year when I do a thesis unit, it has a name. So double purple atomic, a color name, double purple, atomic orange, tangerine dreams, bluest blue, and so on. So these are an image per student. So the students produce, as you do there, without a doubt, produce a lot of work. And I just selected an image for each, for not all of them for sure, but a cross section of the student work. So this is what we do in the fall. There are 6 pieces of work that we accomplish. They're all accompanied with a brief, and the fall actually sets up then the winter studio, which is a common setup. So this is 3 pieces of work in a review 5-ish years ago. Anyway, the work in the fall is set up chronologically to set a bunch of ambitions in play, but also to build up a framework and styles of thinking and a discipline by which the students will eventually in the studio in the winter approach their work. So this slide matters relative to the overall setup of the seminar, and it also matters relative to my work. So these are simply single images per student. The work is quite dense. I would say it's in general, it's unlike other work here at the school. You have people who have been at the school who made huge impacts. Paula, JB, Jim Bassett, I think Jonas is still there. So they know a little bit the regimen or the things that we try to encounter in the groups that I work with. But the key is that we try to get the students teed up so that they can actually do their own work after we finish here, so that they understand how to pose questions, where interest can come from, how to set those in a context and position them culturally and disciplinarily, how to set up methods and techniques for working, and so on. Um, I also neglected to thank Sean for his introduction. I don't know that I can measure to the characteristics that he built up, but the students, I think, they'll be a stand-in for me. Anyway, sorry that I'm not touching on any of the topics for the work, um, but it'd be quite a long lecture. We might be in here till tomorrow morning sometime. But just to give you a sense of, again, the framework for the thesis seminar and then the studio, and this is all studio work that we're looking at now. Um, Happy to work with the students, feel very, very grateful. I've been fortunate to teach at great places, SciArc here, Penn, was a visiting professor at Bartlett for a year, a few years ago, and have been fortunate to spend time around lots of schools in the world and feel very, very grateful and honored, actually, humbled to work with students and faculty and staff at schools and to be able to interact with other kinds of people in schools of architecture. I feel incredibly grateful. I just got lucky. I don't know that I have a lot to offer, but I've been very, very fortunate to be around really interesting people, both with whom I worked, where I studied, with whom I worked in practice, Peter Eisenman and Bob Stern and Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi and so on. Anyway, so that's a real drive-by for just to give you a sense, a little sniff of some of the work that happens in the thesis studios and seminars here. One of the downsides here, I think, is that the digital production has taken on such a dominant role, and that it's really, really hard work to actually structure foundations where students can work in other ways. So a lot of that work, I think, while I think it's really interesting work, I think we suffer. I don't think you do there. I think we suffer a bit here with the lack of, let's say, technique ranges. So, but I'll touch on a little bit of those things as I move through those kinds of things as I move through my work now. So I just want to make three key points. One, architecture is a discipline that touches all disciplines. I think, without being demeaning in any way, I think it's the most interesting discipline in the world, but it must first and foremost be an act of generosity. Secondly, all of you in the room there are cultural agents. You may be professionally trained, and that's fine, but that lies for me, that's under the umbrella of cultural agents who are up to changing the world for the better, generously. And then education and practice must be active constructions, that is transformational, in my mind, over extended periods of time, but also locally. I'm going to really move through things very, very quickly, and they're roughly chronological, the images that I'll show you, but I'm going to build up a little bit about my practice before I get to some of the images. So I've been influenced, as I alluded to, by all kinds of people, conceptual frameworks, objects, places in the world, and so on. And I keep track of those in slides like these. So for me, it's important to recognize both that I participate in the culture of the history of ideas, but also in the discipline that has a much longer, obviously, shelf life or life than I have. So I really want to, I recognize both the influences and I try to articulate what those influences are specifically and what kinds of roles they have played in my development. That's a longer conversation. A few things have been really foregrounded in terms of influences for me. One was the Baroque period, largely in Italy, to do with developments in painting, theater, developments in mathematics to do with the infinite, and so on, and certainly architecture. Um, there are a number of key paintings. Paintings and art in general have been fundamental to my sort of learning arc. I didn't have a drop of knowledge about art before I went to Columbia and lived in New York for 7 years and so on. Various art practices have been really, really important to me because artists generally can touch a broader range of cultural, um, conditions. And I just isolate this Las Meninas, the Children, a painting by Diego Velázquez, which has been important to me in terms of me probing the roles of the picture plane, really. And I think my larger project is at least partially situated to try to augment the station point, the picture plane, and the 600 years of political, capitalistic, spatial consequences of developments in Western perspective. The surrealists and Dadas, incredibly important to me. Duchamp never declared whether he was really a surrealist or a Dada, but Marcel Duchamp was critical to me in two senses. One, in the sense of what qualifies as art. So this is a urinal that we could buy at Home Depot and sign and exhibit it. So that was really, really critical for me. What qualifies as art? And secondly, who can make art? You know, I can make art. I'm not trained as an artist, but I can make art. So those were two fundamental questions that Duchamp, but many, many other things that the surrealists and Dadas contributed to me. And then I worked with Denise and Bob Venturi for 5 years. And Complexity and Contradiction has been an incredibly important book for me. Not that I engage it in its entirety now, but the roles of history that are played there. There are things to do with ambiguity, the both and conditions. And so a number of things. I worked really, really closely with Bob. So, but I read this when I was a student at Columbia. It's remained important to me. Um, Now I'm going to shift now and try to build up my thinking and practice, both teaching and making things a little bit more directly. So a number of people, while I'm not so certain that my work qualifies to have anything like a book, a number of people over the years, particularly recently, have suggested that I try to get some sort of collection of my work together. So I've made an outline of which this is a start about key things which have mattered to me in terms of the development of myself as a contributor to education, perhaps, and a maker of things. So from the grounding in the history of ideas to different epistemological models and forms of knowledge construction, to the ethics, moralities, and values of schools, course, seminar, studio, logics and types, curricular models, relationships to distant disciplines, and so forth. So this is a kind of it's not a Bible. It's a guide for me to really register the things that I think about directly or indirectly, and that might come into some sort of bearing if I try to put something together about my work. On the ground, that's a larger arc. On the ground, this is a sort of an operational palette of things that I generally care about when I work. Not all of them. Certainly, they come and go, and other things are, of course, part of the conversation. But the basic thing I think about is what we can call relational structuring, or what I talk about as relational assemblies or relational contours. That essentially, for me, in a nutshell, has to do with the kinds of relationships, the weight or strengths of those relationships, and the temporal structure or the durational conditions of relationships. Again, it's a super complex medium, uh, the things to do with relational structuring. But if we think, I'm just going to hold up a pencil, a wooden pencil of Ticonderoga #2, I use all the time. And if I think about what makes the pencil possible in the world to different degrees of graspability, there are things like deforestation, mass production, the history of writing, the gestural structure of the body, blah, 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 blah. In other words, I don't see things as objects, really. I see things as structured relationships. And architects fundamentally, in my opinion, all we do, and I hope that we do it generously, is we enter into account with relational conditions and we modify those relational conditions through forms of representation and material structure. Anyway, other key things for me, the generative potential of drawings and visualizations are the big deal. How we work, design methods, that's huge for me. We don't teach that at all really directly in school. We don't unpack that. And there are lots of ways in which we can work. There are lots of representation techniques and so on. I think those are under-taught things in most schools of architecture. I've identified 14 methods. And if you try to produce a house with each one of these methods, you could produce radically, radically, radically different work. 14 radically different pieces of work that draw on your creative capacities, that locate themselves contextually, that produce formal material representational difference, and so on. There are probably 114 methods, and we don't use them. I work with students on methodologies, how we work all the time. We don't use them singularly generally. Sometimes students invent them. We use them in combination. They have different phases and roles and pieces of work and so on. But it matters to me enormously how we work. How we work then is put into play by things like visualizations. When I say visualizations, I'm talking about models and constructs and AR and VR and films and drawings, digital model and so forth. So I said I keep lists of things. Here's a list about 13 visualization thoughts, drawing what might be known, what can be known, and what might never be known. Drawing non-figures to discover what the figures might be, and so on. So I build up, these are ways of me keeping track of things I do so that I can mostly try to get out of my own way. And this image in particular traces some of the things which are, you'll see them, they're persistent things in my work. While I'm super interested in being diverse and versatile, very plastic in terms of how I work in different situations, that's my interest. Most architects are much more locatable within a consistent formal material grammar, set of ideas, the ways in which they practice, and so on. That's fine. And that's probably a better way to do it. I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in really being able to act differently in different situations. So that's why I care about awarenesses of all kinds of representational techniques and ways of working and references to other disciplines and so on that I might tap into. Anyway, these are some things, and again, I won't even mention them. These are some things if you're interested for some reason. These are things which are sometimes consistent in my work. I'll mention a couple: split temporalities and split geographies. That means that we can work in different time frames and in different geographies. So I could work in 1572 Venice, the Tokyo stock market yesterday, and the room that you're in right now, and a piece of work, and students that I work with do those kinds of things all the time. I'm interested in what I call the mechanics of engagement. That is the variables in a piece of work and how they diagrammatically interface with one another. And determinant and contingent relations are important to me, and so on. So I'll get on with things. Otherwise, we will be here all day. But there are a number of things that recur in my work, and I mostly try to get out of my own way when I start a new piece of work. This is not, I live in a Lustron house, and I've been here about 2.5 years now, and I've drawn for 4 hours. So this is a shot of my work table just before I moved here. So that's a workspace for me. I know a little bit about Photoshop, almost nothing. I understand lots of digital applications because all the students that I work with use them: scripting, coding, AI generated things, modeling, Maya, Blender, Rhino, and so on. But I don't operate myself in software other than a little bit of Photoshop work, and I'll show you that. And then there are other kinds of workspaces, things like Facebook or Instagram. Amongst many, many things that I've been interested in is working at different speeds. And I think this is important because different speeds allow us to draw upon different capacities that we have, different collaborations or individual things that we're up to, and so on. So these are projects for me. There are about 50 of them. They're just word ditties, language folds, and they're organized according to, excuse me, what I thought about. I made these 12 years ago. So I identified what I thought at the time were 7 contemporary categories. So materiality, fabrication, production, And out of that, things like milled Baroque, or materializing the space of the construction of a building rather than the building, or atmospheres, X-ray architecture, or change and flux, architecture as a fast change artist, or architecture of multiple psychologies, and so on. So these are fast, these are just my imagination. I had none when I was at your level of understanding, the students in the room. I had zero imagination. I've tried to cultivate that through all kinds of means over the years because I think to contribute culturally in with work that has durability, to see things where others don't is critical. I'm not saying I do that, but it requires an ability to conceptualize, to imagine things outside what's expected. So the other categories, multiple temporalities, duration. Then there's a conceptual category. What about architecture that produces false shadows or three houses in one? And then there's an architectural drawing category. Where is the plan? When is the time of rendering? So and so forth. So these are fast pieces of work. Now I'm going to show you other fast pieces of work. And when I was making some of these, I met Paula and Jim out at SCI-Arc when we were all there. But I started these in 1992. I was teaching at SCI-Arc at the time where I taught 17 years. And we were taking students to the landscape. That's American Southwest, camping week, under trucks, camping tarps, surviving the weather and so forth, but loving the time out there. But when we were out there, I realized I went probably 6 or 7 times to the American Southwest with students. I realized I knew nothing about landscape. So what I decided to do is in 1992, I started to make a drawing a day. They're 24 inches long, they're 18 inches high, and the image is basically 9 by 12 inches. 2 layers of white trace. The trace is bought from the same store in Philadelphia, bought rolls and rolls and rolls of them eventually. The idea was I would get up and shower. I normally get up sometime between 4:30 and 5. I'd get up and shower, I would eat, and I would make a drawing. And I did that for 6 weeks. I would have done it longer. My former wife, Amy, was studying at Cambridge in England. I was teaching at Penn and SCI-Arc at the same time. So I was moving around a lot over the course of a year. So I made these for 6 weeks. And then I've made about 750 of them over the years. And I stopped the year our daughter was born, Ella. It had nothing to do with her. In 2005, I stopped making them, but I've got 2 sets of them that I'd like to make. Now, anyway, they emanate from any number of places. Like the lower left-hand one, I just had some cadmium red acrylic, and I wondered if I could make a series of landscape drawings. So they're made in series. The smallest series is 4. The longest series is 35. In the upper left, I was interested in invisible landscapes. The lower right is an homage to my father. We used to do a lot of winter and summer backpacking in the Sierra Nevada. He died, 1996. So I made a series of them that were an homage to him. Anyway, I don't throw them away. I'd recommend to every single person in the room that you make one thing a day. Doesn't matter what it is. You fold paper, you collect an unusual object, you make marks on paper, whatever you do. It's a fulfilling thing because eventually I think we can do things like develop expertise. We can open channels of our creative capacities that we didn't know we had, and so on. So one a day's totally awesome. I wish I had the time. I don't have time to do any work right now, but I wish I had time to do one a days. So when I finished working with Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi, I had 3 projects actually when I moved to LA. The first one was a little guest house in Santa Barbara or Montecito, California. The second one was I was invited to an international competition for a house in what was at that time West Germany. And then I had a real house project, a small desert house in Southern California, Borrego Springs. And I like to show these. I mentioned this when I talk, but I like to show these because it proves I'm an architect. I've been a licensed architect for like 35 years, 36, 37 years. but some of the work I make, I often get questions about, are you an artist or are you an architect? Anyway, I kind of am, but I don't use building architecture. I use spatiality. So now I'm a little more liberal in terms of what constitutes what I do as an architect. Anyway, these are some drawings that I made for this house. Don't do what I did. I worked about 600 hours and I drew the ground plan 32 times. I constructed it. Quarter inch equals a foot. Don't do what I did. I put about 600 hours into the project and I made $800. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Just a side note, I made those 32 plans in 1990. Subsequently, I thought about what would it be like to build all 32 of those plans at the same time, so that my imaginations allowed me to begin to populate other kinds of questions or possibilities, conceptual conceits that I didn't have in the arsenal, let's say then. Anyway, as I mentioned, Amy was doing a PhD at an MPhil and a PhD at Cambridge in England, and we lived in a house that was about 11 feet wide, 12 feet wide, and I just made a room at that same time that I made the other three houses. I made a room basically, and this got modeled a handful of years later. But I won't go into the content of these. Only to say that when I finished them, I realized they were all the same. I didn't have very many skills. And most importantly, I thought to myself, there was a moment where I said, you're never going to last 50 or 60 years in the discipline here. It's not going to happen. You don't have enough range. You're not smart enough. You don't know how to work on things. So what I did is I made a second version of that house, that desert house, the sort of graphite smudgy drawings, and they're called aspectival drawings, and that is that they're aspects, they're critical fragments of the house. They're not perspectival, they are aspects of the house, aspectival. So this is the first moment in 91 where I started to open the architectural drawing up a little bit, or the spatial drawing up, let's say. I was at Sire, Paul and Jim know this well. There were big characters. I was not at this time in 1996. I'd been at the school for 6 years, but I was still trying to find my way, trying to work out how I might contribute something to the school. And it occurred to me, because there were a number of other people working around the school to do with architectural drawing, that might be a place for me to leverage maybe some contribution, but importantly to me, some growth. So I made a drawing called a strategic plot for a competition for an island off of the coast of New York. The drawing technically is about 125 hours just to make it. It's made of animal x-rays and cut paper and xerographic material and letraset, which is done one letter at a time, and diagrams and foil, xerographic material, and so on. But the drawing serves really three key purposes. The first one's probably the most important, and that is that when I grew up in architecture school, great teachers, both as an undergrad at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo and as a grad student at Columbia, really great places. But basically, I was trained on the conventions of architectural drawing, which I have huge respect for: plans, sections, perspectives, axonometrics, obliques, isometrics, and so on. Fantastic. Huge regard for them, still use them. But it occurred to me in my thinking that I couldn't concentrate my thinking in making a plan. The thinking was out of sync. I had some hunches, I had some wild guesses, I had things that I was fairly certain about. So I try to develop in one language, say conventional drawings, I couldn't get the lions to jump to the same platforms at the same time, meaning that I didn't understand things spatially as I was working on them. So I developed, the important thing is that I began to mix families of representation, language, there are diagrams in this, notations, there are figurative pieces, and so on. And that allowed me to bring to a form of visual thinking what I understood at that time in this phase of the work. I brought things forward as best as I knew them. So that was the key thing that came out of this: mixed levels, mixed families of representation in the same, let's say, space of working. The second thing that occurred to me was that I had really what I thought was pithy content, lots of ideas about nautical cartography, military suppression, islandness, panoptic and panoramic vision, and so on. I had a whole range, and about 15 key ideas. And I then, so in the work, then I developed in what I talked about at the time, inventive programs which would let me contact those interests. So there are things like an axis of mutiny. There are landings for mythical sea travelers with polyp labs that do kelp harvesting and testing. There are camouflagic surfaces. Um, there's a DMZ and so forth. So there are a whole series of programmatic logics which surface as a way to contact. I wouldn't do it the same way now for sure, but the programmatic thinking allowed me to begin to let some of the ideas surface and articulate them through spatial and representational means. The third thing that came important to me, and this came out of my time at SCI-Arc, was that the drawing was an object in itself. The visualization, what we make, they have their own volitions, their own intentions, their own integrity and fidelity, regardless of what we're working on. So those are super important things. I'm going to mention one thing that I alluded to in the programmatic thinking, and this is a really, really big thing for me right now, what I call the naming problem. And that is that in conventional architectural thinking, we use typologies and architectural and landscape architecture and so on. Generally, we use conventional programmatic terms that are often linked only with function. A bowling alley, a foyer, a house, whatever. And my contention is that when we name things, that the project is often nearly finished as a result of naming something. So if I ask you to design a foyer in a building, it's probably going to be about 2 stories high. There will be an information desk over to the left or right. There will be a bank of elevators in the deeper space, probably some planting near the information desk, and we just came through a door. So that if the pencil was a pencil that I held up a short while ago, but it's structured by the kinds of things, its availability in the world is structured to different degrees of graspability or participation by things that are structuring it. I think about how we structure conditions rather than what we name them. So I just want to underscore that. There are lots of, I have lots, they're not pet peeves, they're things that I think are really, really important for me, at least in my practice in teaching. And the naming problem is one of them. It's a much longer discussion, which we don't have time to go into and may or may not be of interest to you all out there. So, but there are a number of things that I've identified over the years that matter to me and might make me particular relative to other people. Not everybody's particular, but there are things about me that they're not necessarily interesting or right. They're just particular things about me in terms of the way I go about education and working. So I continued then in 2001. I looked at a competition for a museum in Central California, and I continued to try to open the architectural drawing as a generative potential. So I began to understand that the latent and tacit knowledge that I could understand as a result of making these kinds of drawings was really, really important to me. The discipline by which I design things within the drawing, whether it's that font, or whether that figure should be closer to that diagram, and so on. Anyway, I made a series of drawings for this museum. This is a thematic drawing, which has to do with the primary content or issues or ideas of the work. So when I was working in this way, this is a long time ago, and if I had time, I'd probably still work in some of these ways when it was appropriate. But when I work, I don't sit down and say, I'm going to make a plan or I'm going to make a section. I try to understand the phase in which I'm working and what kinds of work a visualization needs to do. So I give drawings a program. I need to work on cross-temporal conditions. I need to look at things which have levels of disappearance. and historical consequences and reference and so forth. So I sort of write a program and then I work through the work through the drawings. I don't stick to that program or the performative characteristics of the drawing. I let things transform themselves, the nature of the questions, the nature of the ways in which I'm working. As I discover things, I let those things change. But I don't take for granted, I use plans and sections and obliques. I use those things all the time. But all forms of representation have limits. They do things well, they don't do other things well. So I'm trying to work out, are there more or less effective ways to work on things? Anyway, these are some of the drawings. They're 24 inches high and 36 inches long. They're some of the drawings for the museum. And then we made a quick model. This was probably 5 years after. Made a quick. This is a kind of chipboard model. This probably takes 600 or 800 hours to get it to be something that's really, that's touching the key interests of the work and so on. I've been interested, amongst other things, like erasure. Architects always add things, so I've been interested in erasure as a generative representational technique and a spatial technique. So these are some relational drawings that I made for a house that I was going to try to design called Bleached Out, where I would essentially erase furniture, infrastructure, patterns of use, routines, and so on, and then reboot that emptied or erased ecology with a pair of what I called reflexive objects that would come back in and then initiate emergent potential with this now erased or bleached out or emptied realm. Continued the architectural drawing and the possibilities for a house that I called Speculative House Fast Twitch. And I was working hard at the time, but the work was really, really slow in terms of how I was ideating. So I decided to work on a house analogically, that is through likenesses. So there are garden surfaces that are like empty game boards. There are parts of an architecture that are like a cuckoo clock. There are parts of things that are like petticoats. So likenesses drove the work. When I work properly, this is my sketch pad. There are legal pads. And in this project, there were about 50 of these ideas. It's what you all do. Ideas, references, thoughts about formal things, and so on. Anyway, with this analogical thinking in play, I just said, you got to start simply, man. You're working on way too many things. Architecture couldn't hold the things that you try to work on if you could structure it, if they're any good. So I started with ground, sky, and horizon. I said, that's the way you start. And I began to work, and over time, I made a series of drawings again. I started to work on hybrid archetypes, hidden language systems, folded technologies, things to do with perceptual logics and flattening and deepening things in the desert. Anyway, I made a whole series of drawings, and then a couple of years after that, the same fellow who modeled Sen, who worked with me, we made a quick model. It's not heavily worked about the proposal. So there's basically an eating space, there's a sleeping space, and there's a living space, and you live in two baskets on the outside. In this space, if you can see my cursor, the tall one is filled with logs. All these are made of steel. They're finished in a particular way. But this one is meant to dematerialize over 100 years and basically leave a pile of logs on the site. So they're cuckoo clock-like sleeping chambers. This is just a view inside of the sleeping chambers. There's a little stair that's 3 inches wide at the top that goes to nowhere. I'm not touching the content. I'm just describing some of the things in the work. There are 3 chromed shadows. There's a labyrinth that you can't get into. It's got a red object that makes noise, but you can't see it. There's a half-size miniature, half-size cast bronze biplane. There's a billiard ball, sort of an egg-shaped billiard ball as an object that sits inside of this lozenge and comes out once in a while. There's a pink dust garden, and this object where you sleep moves back and forth over the pink dust garden when no one's there at the site, and so on. There are lots of ideas that emerged. The important thing is I was working analogically, and was able to generate the work fairly quickly, and it would need a lot of work to get somewhere. This is the living space, looking down the face of the living space, and there's a miniature version of the proposal built on constructed, or would be constructed if the project were built, constructed on the side of that space. And there's a mechanical hawk that belongs to belongs to the architecture. This is one of the baskets you live in. Again, very, very fortunate to participate in lots of things. That year our daughter was born, I was asked to participate in the Prague Art Biennale biennial, and with two former students, made a proposal for what I call the metaspheric zoo, and it's a cross between metaphor and atmosphere. I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomena. That was my charge to participate in Prague. Anyway, we made what's called a kind of strategic thematic plot, of which these are biopsies. And that's about a 15-foot long drawing that was made in 45 pieces and put together as a puzzle. We were just looking at the digital base, and they're cut paper parts and drawn parts and gold leaf and blah, blah, blah that we sent to Prague. In '09, I was able to get, at the time, what we called a research through making grant here at the school. And I made a piece of work with a former student, Justin Fogel, called Spatial Blooms. And I was essentially interested, and I asked when former students, those are the people who work with me, normally just one at a time and not all the time. I pay them and so on. When I invite them to be collaborators, I don't just say, so and so, you do this. So they're involved in the work. But I was interested in how we might crossbreed landscape elements, let's say ponds, fences, revetments, and so on. The elements of landscape and landscape architecture. Could we cross those with landscape and garden types, picturesque gardens, the meandering garden, the open field landscape, and so on? And could we then cross those things with what we talked about as landscape biologies? And that would be things like insect infestations or droughts, things which have temporal consequences in the landscape. And we're interested in hybridizing those things, those three different categories of things, to see if we could produce an alternative way to think about both landscapes and, say, spatial settings or architecture, maybe. Anyway, there are things like test tube berms, and there are real indexical and notational landscapes which coexist. There are fabric predators and so on. My dear friend Coy Howard, who basically took me under his wing when I turned up at SciArc, in 2001, the school moved downtown, and I was fortunate to teach in all three locations, but we moved downtown in 2001. And Coy, I never collaborated with anyone other than working in offices. And Coy and I basically sort of picked up the phone at the same time, and we said to each other, we don't know Los Angeles. We think about making a body of work that allows us to understand more about LA. So we made sort of 7 conceptual conceits, series of sonic monuments, a series of public event spaces, a big garden, market, park over Broadway. And eventually we focused on 5 speculative rooftop houses. This is 2001, 2, 3. Rolls and rolls and rolls of drawings, technical trace, and so on. I finally drew the plans, of which these are scrappy iPhone images. I drew them in the 5 houses in 2020. So just mostly when I work with other people, it's mostly to build our friendship, to enjoy the pleasures of sharing, thoughts, curiosities, fascinations, and so on. Again, I work on just a bunch of things. I worked on a series of vertical surfaces, or let's say building envelopes, to be straightforward, in 2017. These are cut paper, made quickly, but just trying to imagine through, in this case, being influenced by medical imaging technology, what a building envelope might be. The whole drawing, including the top, everything's part of a possible enclosure surface skin. My dear friend Nat Shard and I won in 2012. We won Pamphlet Architecture 34. Very, very grateful for the opportunity. And we framed a series of interests. You have to pitch for the competition, for the publication, you pitch a project. And we were interested in it. We both are interested in indeterminacy and contingency. In architecture, that is an architecture that doesn't predict what you do, but lets you take it up with some grounding, but allows you to make your own sense of it. So we made a project which comprises a fifth of the book, or 16 pages, where we were interested in forensic, a laboratory for forensic drawing was the program. And we were working more broadly on questions of contingency and indeterminacy. So I made a series of drawings, of which these are some. And then, excuse me, Nat Shard, boy's great. Nat's great. They're incredible teachers, architects, and so on. Nat's been making, amongst other things over the years, these drawing instruments. So we decided to make a pair of drawing instruments, one for Nat and one for myself. And his is on the right, mine's on the left. And ostensibly, the drawing instruments throw paint at each other. Of course, they're up to a lot more than that. Um, but the things that we got involved in this work allowed us to open up understandings and maybe insights about the possibilities for contingent and indeterminate architectures. So each of the setups have a narrative dome. There's a paint throw interrupter that you see in the deep space, and then we each have a drawing. So we did then a series of time-lapse photographs of the paint throws, excuse me, as part of our work to try to understand more critically, but also just in terms of friendship, collaboration, sharing things, this business of indeterminacy. We've subsequently have been fortunate to we did a month-long workshop in Winnipeg at the ICA, and at the same time, they offered us a space where they offered an exhibition of our work. So this, I like to show these images because of some of Nat's drawing instruments, and then other things. There are other things in the room that Nat's done, and that certainly some of my work is here as well. Then when I was the Sir Bannister Fletcher visiting professor at the Bartlett, we had Bob Sheila was director at the time, offered us the entire ground floor. I did a bunch of things at the Bartlett, but he offered us the ground floor to stage an exhibition. So these are some of these are some of the images from the exhibition that we made. And really, really fun. Bartlett, I've been fortunate, I've probably been to the school 50 times for lots of different things, but very, very grateful for those kinds of opportunities and to turn up with you all here today. It's an honor. It's an honor to be here. So thanks for turning up. I'm going to move super quickly now through my others. There's sort of one-a-days, but it's the way that I got invested a little bit in Photoshop. You know, I could answer Sean's emails, or I can text Paula and Jim and Jonas once in a while. I can do those things reasonably, but I have no digital skills. So I made a series of about 155 what I call speculative house garden landscape proposals at midnight, sort of when I'm finished with other things that I've committed to during the day. Anyway, what I do is I appropriate an image or two, maybe three, my work, something I find interesting online, and then I just work with those things to try to invent possible thinkings about house gardens and landscapes. I think of them as drone-ish views, not literally, but to give me some sort of bearing in the work. So again, I don't throw them away. I make them quickly. Again, I have no skill, so this is all very, very crude. But I made in 2018, I think I made 155 of these. So for example, I just appropriated one of the plans, an earlier plan version of the work that Coy and I did, and I just worked on it and said, could this be a possible house garden landscape? Anyway, I didn't do them exactly one a day, but they have a one a day sort of time commitment, hour and a half most. This is just using my work. these are using my work. Same thing. Same thing. One of the vertical surfaces is just appropriated. I found an interesting little motorcycle and used some of my drawing parts. They're really, really fun uh, for lots of reasons. They make me feel like I'm getting something done because I have no time to work at all. So that if I'm accomplishing something, that made me feel decent. But also, my imagination was kept alive, my creative capacities, my compositional skills, I could work on them and so on. They're really, really fun. I don't throw them away. I don't make heavy judgments about them. I'm just trying to work on Photoshop skills with this background of house, garden, and landscape thinking, and so on. So I'll show you about 35 of them or so. So they're 4 or 5 times as many as I'm going to show you here. I'll just move through these really quickly so we're not here all day. Oops, that one got duplicated. Um, Again, fun, formal material vocabularies. Just doing these, I have way greater range. The reason I'm interested in greater range of formal material vocabularies is I might need to draw upon any range of those to structure relationships if I'm working on spatial proposals, let's say. So from other forms of integration and culture, I'm trying to understand film and painting and sculpture and literature and so on. I try to develop a range, a kind of room of things that might contribute to work when I'm making it or when I'm teaching. So a friend, Jeff Halstead, great architect, thinker, teacher, he saw some of these and he said, let's do a quick collaboration. He's a really good and quick modeler, amongst other things. So that's me. That's a translation, just formal. This is me. This is a this is one of the earlier studies, and this is the final, just quick ZBrush work trying to translate this, and that then becomes this. So again, quick work by me, quick work by Jeff and me, and then say, okay, this is some work. What can be discussed? What are the things that can be learned, and so on. More Photoshop work. I was thinking about sort of elevations of things again, but what I call proto objects or proto objectives. So again, just finding things. I'm going to go back. And I got super, because I'm so clumsy with Photoshop, I eventually got really interested in how I produce certain qualities by, in this case, misusing the paintbrush tool. Anyway, I made a whole series of these, and then eventually I made one that's the most important one. And that is just, again, this is just tracking the ways in which I cut and paste or use the paintbrush tool. This got to be really interesting for me, the sort of backstory of how I was producing effects that might actually contribute to the work. I'll move quickly. I've been fortunate, again, lots of things, lucky, grateful, honored, humbled, all those things. In 15, I got invited to design a birdhouse for auction for a nonprofit in Italy. And there were, I think, 29 other architects invited. And so with 3 former thesis students, a super, super short time frame, we actually developed 13 proposals. I'm influenced by a lot of things in Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird is one of them. Anyway, we made 13 sketch proposals and then picked up on one of them and developed it. So this is called the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel. It's a physical thing. I won't go into the content because we're running out of time here, but it's milled and 3D printed and painted by an auto body painter and so on. It's to do with birds and aerial thinking and surveillance and human and non-human relationships and so on. So I don't make physical things very often, but I like making them. And it was fun. It's always fun to work with others, which I do on occasion. So my good friend Mark West, who's part of the drawing architecture group, which is about 15 of us from mostly Europe and the US. Anyway, it's a group where we get together twice a year and discuss our work for 2 days, twice a year. It's super fun, interesting. Peter Cook and Mike Webb of Archigram, Michael Young, Mark West, this guy. So anyway, I was having dinner with Mark one night, and I said, Mark, I thought of that. He knew the work, knew this project, and I said I thought of it as an ecology, as an emergent and becoming um, spatial condition. He said, let's do a collaboration. So we made a series of images that look at that bird motel over and through time. Then there's a second bird motel which uses some of the digitally modeled parts from the first one because A, I don't have a lot of money, and B, we don't have a lot of time, and C, I pay people who work with me. Anyway, I had another series of ideas about a whole series of floating bird motels. So this is called El Dorado, and it has things like dancing bird alphabet topiary. It has a dead tech garden. It has a talisman where it's a dining table, basically. Here's the dead tech garden. It's kitted out with all kinds of aerial things that are made out of shrubs, berries, flowers, things that birds can enjoy. Wallace Stevens, there's a sail which is an homage to Wallace Stevens. This is the stuffed technology garden, and then we made a series of drawings that are basically storytelling mechanisms. So there are bits of plans, there are secondary and tertiary views of things. We're really using representation actively to try to tell stories about some of the interests of these bird motels. So this is these are some of the images, some of the final images for that bird motel. Then there's a third bird motel, which ostensibly 3D prints Wallace Stevens' poems from this guy. He's been an influence and so on. Anyway, it has things like an artificial weather garden. It has a working log. It has a zoetropic restaurant that travels around with these. There are lots of them. There's a talisman. There's a theater. There's housing and so on. So those are the programmatic elements. But again, become increasingly interested in the sky. Architects never worked there. Sorry, these are all first passes, really not heavily worked on. This is an artificial weather garden for the birds. Anyway, I'm increasingly interested in the sky. Currently just starting a piece of work which has to do with Google Earth imagery as a social construction. Anyway, so these are some of the images of the carefully worked on, working with Carl Heckman, a former student. Fun, super fun. Not heavy judgments, just a handful of interest. Let's work on some things. When I was working with Nat on another project for Orford Ness, which is a military ballistic testing site, basically an abandoned one, but it's in England. I made a series of what I called aerial diptych follies, cut paper. There's an entertainment part above, and then there's a surveillance part below. These are analogical drawings. Anyway, I then got a small amount of seed funding from the school to look at questions that I was interested in to do with relationships between imaging and digital modeling. So we used the aerial diptych folly drawings as vehicles by which we could then begin to work on, with a former student, Oliver Popadich, questions about relationships between images and modeling. So for example, could you model notations, or in rendering, wireframe share some information with a render, same point of view, what can be discussed, what might be discovered in our kind of think tank probative questions about image modeling relationships. So they were all worked on in Blender. We cared about everything in the space of Blender. Everything has potential, everything. Just like when I work on a drawing table. Doesn't mean we're going to use everything, but we keep our periscopes up to see what might be available to us in the conversations of the image modeling problem. So there are 3 proposals. This is the first one, which is based on a kind of theatrical setting. These are images of the Blender. These are renderings from Blender. Then there's a second one, which is interested in the space of inflection. So if the aerial diptych folly is here, in the image modeling questions, what about the space of inflection around it? Anyway, again, everything's modeled in Blender, and we're still asking questions, image modeling questions. What about file sizes? Can that matter with respect to image modeling questions? CMYK, RGB. Can you model light sources? All kinds of things that we were just trying to work on in an experimental way to see if we could discover something about what now is a prominent discussion or has in the past 6, 8, 10, 15 years, images, the roles of images in, let's say, multiple disciplines, but specifically in architecture. So image modeling questions. And there's one of the bird motels because Carl and Oliver and I were working on these two separate projects at the same time in 18. Anyway, there's one more. And this one, again, this is just, we care about all of this. We care about the construction of the digital workspace, which I work on a lot with students now to see if there's potential, not just what we see figuratively, but the whole setup, when you erase things and so on, where's the information go? Anyway, we made a third proposal. Sorry, I'm going to go back just quickly. We wondered, for example, do images have back sides? And if you can see my cursor, there's this cut paper, bit flowers, and a few birds. So we wondered if images have back sides. We began to work on that. So yes, in fact, that cut paper, that image of that cut paper does have back side, and that's it. And in fact, it also has a different front side that we were looking at a digital model. That's a digital model. An image like flat, seems flat. And so we wondered about these, again, these kinds of questions. And in this one, we're working on the instruments that might get involved in these aerial diptych follies. So there are a whole series of different kinds of instruments in this one that were the focus of this particular set of questions around the image modeling, sort of problems. So these are some of the final images we made, and really, really fun. I'd like to pick up that work again. I've been influenced a lot by histories, triptychs, domes, and church domes, and still lifes have been a part of that. So I got some seed funding again from the school to wonder about important precedents, histories, triptychs, domes, and still lifes. And there are all of those things in the project. Chinese scroll painting, reconstruction of Borromedes Church in Rome, and so on. Turkish towns, shrines at Ise. So we wondered if we could take those important precedents and by setting them up in 3 different strategies, could we understand a different potential about historically important things to us? So this is what we call niche. It's all modeled. So we're just looking at the precedents in all 3 of the strategies that I'm going to show you.
Sorry, Perry, I know we've got the folks coming in after us hanging around the doors. Is it all right if we stop here for a moment and maybe just leave room for 1 or 2 questions from the students?
Sure. Do you want to ask? I could just move through the images and not talk about them and take questions, Sean.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Yep, go for it.
So your concept of relations, like in relationships, and how a pencil isn't just a pencil, and how you combine multiple kinds of concepts and thoughts into your drawings to make them almost whole. I feel like that kind of begs the question of connectivity and how everything in our world is connected and intertwined, and how to understand that, like, if you want to understand one thing, you kind of have to understand everything, or at least be willing to do that.
That is true-ish. That's I think mostly in Eastern philosophies and belief systems incorporate that. That's true. I'm not sure of your name, but we don't have time. But thank you for the question. Yes. There are latent and specific or particular kinds of relational conditions that link things in multiple kinds of ways. And that's a very, very complex question that has their discursive relationships, their rhetorical relationships, their embodied relationships, and so on. So there are lots of kind of relational properties. When I work, I don't think quite that way. Yes, they are linked, but things are linked in different degrees of graspability or strength and so on. So yes, as a relational thinker, that assertion, that sense that you shared, that wouldn't get me very far because there's not a lot of specificity. So I look for relational specificity to try to develop specific formations, precise formations. Anyway, I'll race. You tell me when to stop, Sean.
I think we'll have to call it a close there, Perry. So everyone, please give Perry a great round of applause.
Thank you very much. I don't think I realized, Sean, that someone was coming in there. Sorry,
You're all good. All right. I think it's just a testament to the richness of your work.
Thank you very much, Sean, and everybody else. Just the last images, and you're out of there. So thanks a lot. Good skill, everybody. You're all cultural agents. Have a good go at things.
Thank you, Barry.
Good
Bye.
to join you. Yeah, talk to you soon, Sean. Bye-bye. Bye.